Welcome back to Dance Plane. I'm Edward.
I'm Lily.
And today we're tackling a pretty heavy topic today. We're going to be diving into the brutality of dictators throughout history. You know, we got a ton of really interesting sources from you guys on this one.
Yeah, we did. It's going to be, well, let's just say fascinating and unsettling, right? I mean, we're talking about some of the most notorious figures in history.
Exactly. And just to give you a taste, one of these dictators was responsible for the deaths of somewhere between 25% and 37% of their entire country's population.
Yeah.
That's almost unbelievable, isn't it?
Yeah, the scale of it is just mind-boggling. And that's kind of what we're going to be wrestling with today. Like, how do we even assess brutality?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's not as simple as just like counting up the number of deaths, right?
Numbers are important, but they don't tell the whole story. We need to also consider the nature of their policies. You know, were they intentionally designed to inflict suffering? What were the motivations, ideology, paranoia, greed, and what were the long-term impacts on society, not just in terms of deaths, but, you know, the whole picture.
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. Like, we need to look at the motivations, the methods, the consequences,
Yeah.
the whole shebang.
Exactly. So with that in mind, let's start with a figure who's, well, he always comes up in these discussions. Mao Zedong.
Mao Zedong, okay, yeah. Leader of communist China. I remember learning about him in school, but to be honest, it's all a bit hazy. Why is he considered so brutal?
Well, Mao's legacy is super complicated, right? I mean, there are a lot of different perspectives on him, but there's no question that his policies resulted in a devastating loss of human life, especially during the Great Leap Forward.
The Great Leap Forward, wasn't that like his big push to modernize China's economy?
It was, but it was a total disaster. Mao forced collectivization of agriculture, set these insane production targets, and completely ignored, like, basic realities of farming.
Yeah.
And that led to one of the worst famines in history.
Oh, wow. Yeah, the reports we got cited estimates of 40 to 70 million deaths from the Great Leap Forward. Can't even wrap my head around that number.
It's hard to grasp, isn't it? And it wasn't just the famine. You had political purges, forced labor camps. It all added up to this unimaginable loss of life. And, you know, this kind of disregard for human life in pursuit of his vision, well, it's a theme we see over and over again with these brutal dictators.
Yeah, that's a chilling thought. Okay, so speaking of unimaginable loss, another dictator who has to be part of this conversation is Adolf Hitler.
Of course. The Holocaust is one of the most horrific events in human history, right? I mean, the systematic murder of 6 million Jewish people by the Nazi regime, it's hard to even find the words for it.
Yeah, there are no words. I think everyone knows about the horrors of the Holocaust, but what's interesting to me is that a lot of these sources are framing Hitler's brutality within the larger context of World War II.
Right, and that's a really important point. The Holocaust was this targeted, systematic genocide, which is just horrifying. But we also can't forget the broader impact of Hitler's aggression. World War II resulted in an estimated 17 million civilian deaths on top of the military casualties.
Wow. So with Hitler, it's not just the Holocaust, but it's also the massive death toll of a global war he started. It makes you wonder, how do we compare these different types of brutality? I mean, is systematic genocide somehow worse than deaths caused by war?
That's a really tough question. The Holocaust was fueled by this ideology of extermination, you know, wiping out an entire group of people, whereas deaths in war, while horrific, they're usually a consequence of broader geopolitical conflicts. Both are tragic, obviously, but they're different facets of human cruelty.
Right. The context and motivations behind the violence are important for understanding all the different ways brutality can manifest.
Yeah.
You know, we're seeing that with all these different dictatorships.
Yeah, totally. So let's shift our focus to another dictator whose regime left a devastating mark on history, Joseph Stalin.
Stalin, yeah, the iron fist of the Soviet Union. I feel like his brutality is kind of overshadowed by World War II, but from what I'm seeing in these sources, it's every bit as horrific.
Absolutely. Stalin, like Mao, wanted to transform his nation through rapid industrialization and collectivization. And again, the human cost was astronomical. It's estimated that his policies caused the deaths of around 20 million people.
20 million? Wow, how did that even happen? What were his methods?
Well, Stalin used a whole range of brutal tactics. You had the Great Purge, where he basically eliminated anyone he perceived as a threat. Then you have the Gulag labor camps, which were just brutal. And then the forced famine in Ukraine, the Holodomor. It was a systematic reign of terror.
Man, it's like there's a pattern here. These powerful leaders obsessed with ideology and progress, willing to sacrifice millions to achieve their vision.
Yeah, it's a chilling observation, but it's a pattern we see again and again. And it's crucial to remember that behind these numbers, there were real people. Each one of them had a life, hopes, dreams. It's just heartbreaking.
Okay, before we move on, we've got one more figure to discuss, Genghis Khan. He's from a very different era, though, right? How can we even compare him to these 20th century dictators?
It is a challenge because the historical context is so different. Genghis Khan, he unified the Mongol tribes and led them on these massive conquests across Asia and into Europe. And yeah, his military campaigns were incredibly brutal. They left a trail of destruction and death.
And we're talking about a lot of deaths, right?
Yeah, some estimates say his conquests may have resulted in up to 40 million deaths, but that number is definitely debated among historians, and it's important to remember that warfare was basically constant during Genghis Khan's time. I mean, his brutality was horrific, yes, but it was in many ways a product of his era.
So we can't condone his actions, obviously, but we have to acknowledge that the standards of warfare were so different back then.
Exactly. And that just underscores the importance of historical context, right? When we're evaluating the actions of these leaders. I mean, Genghis Khan lived in a totally different world. But the 20th century dictators, they were operating in a time when, at least in theory, there was a greater understanding of human rights and the value of individual lives.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. So as we wrap up this first part of our deep dive, it seems like we're already running into the complexities of trying to judge brutality. Mao's policies led to an insane number of deaths. Hitler's regime was driven by racial hatred. Stalin's terror was systematic and pervasive. And Genghis Khan's brutality, well, it was arguably just a product of his time. It's complicated.
Yeah, it is. And we've only just scratched the surface. There are more dictators to discuss, and we'll keep grappling with this question. How do we measure the immeasurable? Welcome back, Ansplainers. We're continuing our exploration of some of history's most brutal dictators.
Yeah, so far we've talked about Mao, Hitler, Stalin, Genghis Khan. And honestly, it's mind-blowing to think about the sheer number of people who died under their regimes.
It is. And it's becoming clear that just trying to count up the deaths, it doesn't really capture the whole picture of brutality, you know?
Exactly. So where do we go from here? Who's next on our list?
Well, let's shift our focus to Southeast Asia. Let's talk about Pol Pot.
Pol Pot, okay. That name rings a bell, but I can't quite place it.
He was the leader of the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia from 1975 to 1979. His goal was to create this, agrarian utopia, completely purging the country of any modern influences.
An agrarian utopia, huh? That sounds almost peaceful in theory, I guess.
Yeah, the reality was anything but. The Khmer Rouge, they forced millions of people from cities into rural labor camps. They abolished money, religion, private property. Anyone they saw as an intellectual or even just a potential threat, they were executed.
That sounds a little like what happened during China's Cultural Revolution, doesn't it? Like, were there connections there?
Yeah, there are some parallels for sure. Both regimes were trying to purify their societies and eliminate enemies, real or imagined. But what's really disturbing about Pol Pot's regime is the percentage of the population that was killed. We're talking 1.7 to 2.5 million deaths in a country that had only about 8 million people at the time.
Wait, you're saying something like 25% to 37% of the entire Cambodian population was killed under Pol Pot?
Exactly. Even though the raw numbers are smaller than some of the other dictators we've talked about, that proportion, it makes Pol Pot's regime one of the most brutal in history.
It's almost impossible to comprehend.
Yeah.
That nearly a third of an entire country was just wiped out.
It really highlights something important. Sometimes it's not just about the total number of deaths, right? It's the impact on a society as a whole. Pol Pot's regime, it basically eradicated an entire generation of Cambodians.
It's terrifying to see what happens when ideology is taken to such extremes. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about someone whose brutality was driven less by ideology and more by personal greed. Leopold II of Belgium.
Ah, yes. Leopold II. He was the one who controlled the Congo Free State, right?
The Congo Free State, that's right. Was that officially a Belgian colony?
Not exactly. It was more like, well, it was Leopold's personal fiefdom.
His personal fiefdom. What does that even mean?
It means he basically owned it. He had total control over the territory, all the resources, and especially the people. And what he did there was just horrible.
I'm guessing this isn't going to be a happy story.
No, not at all. Leopold was obsessed with extracting wealth from the Congo, mostly rubber. He forced the Congolese people into slave labor, setting these impossible quotas for rubber collection.
And what happened if they couldn't meet those quotas?
They faced unimaginable cruelty. Mutilation was common, often severing hands or feet. Villages were burned. People were massacred. It was just horrific, all driven by profit.
Oh my God. How many people died under his rule?
Estimates say around 10 million Congolese died because of his policies. And remember, this was happening in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, at the same time that many European nations were claiming they were on these so-called civilizing missions in Africa.
The hypocrisy is just mind-blowing. Claiming to spread enlightenment while running a brutal regime based on exploitation and slavery.
It's one of the darkest chapters of human history and often overlooked. But it's important to remember, it shows that brutality can come from all kinds of places. It's not always tied to grand ideologies or political ambitions. Sometimes it's just about pure greed.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought. Okay, so far we've covered Mao's policies, Hitler's genocide, Stalin's terror, Pol Pot's destruction of Cambodian society, and now Leopold II's greed-driven exploitation. It's a lot to process.
It is. But remember, we're not just here to recount the horrors of the past. We're trying to understand them, learn from them. Each of these dictators, they represent a failure of humanity, a failure of our systems, our empathy, our ability to prevent atrocities.
Okay, before we move on, I think we've got one more dictator to cover in this section, Ivan the Terrible. He seems like a bit of a wild card compared to the others.
Yeah, he's definitely from a different era. Ivan the Terrible was the first Tsar of Russia, ruling in the 16th century. So we're going even further back in time than Genghis Khan.
Wow. So how does his brutality stack up against the others we've talked about?
Well, his methods were definitely brutal. He was known for his paranoia, his tendency towards extreme violence. He created this special police force, the Oprichnina, basically a death squad that terrorized the nobility and anyone who opposed him.
So we're talking outright executions here.
Oh, yeah. Historians estimate that around 60,000 people were killed directly by Ivan's regime. But the true number of deaths is probably a lot higher. His policies also caused tons of displacement and hardship.
Okay, so maybe the raw numbers aren't as high as some of the others, but his methods were still incredibly cruel. And he definitely left a lasting impact on Russia.
Absolutely. And it raises an important question. How do you compare brutality across such vast stretches of time? I mean, the world Ivan the Terrible lived in, it was completely different from the 20th century.
Right, that's true. The standards of governance, warfare, even just what was considered an acceptable punishment were totally different back then.
Exactly. So while we can say that Ivan the Terrible's reign was brutal, it's tough to put him on the same scale as someone like Mao or Hitler. They were operating in completely different contexts.
We're running into that context issue again. It really does matter when you're trying to make sense of these historical figures.
It really does. As we move into the final part of our deep dive, we'll try to bring all this together and see if we can come to some kind of conclusion, or at least a better understanding of this really complicated topic.
All right, Dansplainers, we're headed into the final stretch. Get ready for a thought-provoking one. All right, Dansplainers, welcome back to the deep dive. We're wrapping up our exploration of brutal dictators today. And, well, it's been a journey.
It really has. We've been to some dark places in human history, haven't we?
We have. Mao, Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, Leopold II, even Ivan the Terrible. Heavy stuff.
Yeah. But, you know, as we've said before, it's not just about rehashing the horrors of the past. It's about understanding them, learning from them, and hopefully doing what we can to prevent them from happening again.
I feel like I've learned so much. Like, I honestly had no idea about the scale of the atrocities in the Congo Free State under Leopold II. It's insane to think that greed can be just as powerful a driver of brutality as any ideology.
Absolutely. That's such a critical point. Leopold II's reign, it's a stark reminder that brutality can take many forms. It's not always about grand schemes or political ambitions. It can be about pure, unadulterated greed.
So now that we're here, at the end of our deep dive, I have to ask, have we answered our initial question? Can we actually say who was the most brutal dictator?
You know, that's the question I was expecting. And honestly, I don't think there is a simple answer. It's not a competition. And frankly, trying to rank these dictators based on their brutality almost feels disrespectful to the victims. Each of these individuals was responsible for unimaginable suffering, and their actions just, they defy easy comparison.
Yeah, I agree. But even if we can't rank them, what can we say about what we've learned? What are the common threads that run through all these stories of dictatorship and brutality?
Well, I think one big takeaway is just how many forms brutality can take. We've seen genocide, forced labor, deliberate starvation, brutal conquests. even just exploitation for personal gain. Each case is unique, of course, but they all share that same disregard for human life.
It's this toxic mix, right?
Mm.
Ideology, unchecked ambition, a complete lack of empathy. It fuels all of it.
You got it. These dictators often believed they were working towards some greater good, whether that was a communist utopia, a racially pure nation, or just their own personal wealth. And they were willing to sacrifice anything, anyone, to reach that goal. The ends justified the means, no matter how horrific those means were.
It's terrifying, honestly, to think that humans are capable of such things.
It is. But we also have to remember that these dictators didn't operate in a vacuum. They were enabled by systems of power, by ideologies that dehumanized entire groups of people, by cultures of silence and fear. We have to look at the bigger picture, too.
So what does all this mean for us today? What can we actually learn from all this to prevent it from happening again?
The biggest lesson, I think, is the importance of vigilance. We have to be wary of any ideology, any leader that tries to divide us, to dehumanize others, to justify violence in the name of some greater good. That's always a warning sign.
We have to hold our leaders accountable, speak out against injustice, remember the victims. We have to learn from the past to build a better future.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Remembering is so important. It's the first step to making sure history doesn't repeat itself.
Well, Dansplainers, that's about it for this episode of The Deep Dive. This has been a really tough conversation, but incredibly important. We've stared into the face of the worst of humanity, but I think we've also seen how important it is to keep fighting for a better world.
Absolutely. And as always, this is just the beginning. Keep exploring these topics, challenge your own assumptions, keep learning.
And don't forget to visit us at www.dansplain.xyz for more deep dives, articles, and partner products to help you understand the world.
See you next time.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep dansplaining the world around you.